Hi there, everybody, and welcome to today's AOP Live. First of all, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Philip Ideson, and I'm the Managing Director here at Art of Procurement, and I'm joined on screen by my partner at Art of Procurement, Kelly Barner. Kelly, thanks for joining me.
Absolutely, Phil. Thank you, everybody, for being here with us today.
And today's AOP Live, the format, if you've never been to one of these before, is really all about the questions that you have asked in advance and some that our team have put together to really pose to our guests around the topic of the day. We received a lot of questions through the registration process, so we've used some of those or paraphrased some of those as we go through the conversation today. Now, if you do have any questions as we're going through the session, there should be a box underneath this video where you can just tap in any question that you may have. And actually, that's the role that Kelly will be playing. Kelly will be keeping an eye on all the questions and comments that you put in that box so that she's able to bring those across into the session at certain points during the conversation. So please don't hesitate to do that. Now, today's topic, the title of the AOP Live is Rethink, Reflect, Reexamine, Strengthening Global Procurement Operating Models. Procurement operating models is always a topic that I'm really passionate about, and I always find really interesting to see what's changing, where folks are kind of in the maturity journey, and some tips on how we kind of adjust and adapt based on all the change that we've seen over the last few years. And we'll talk about if procurement itself is due for a change themselves in terms of what are the operating models that we should be considering. We'll be joined by Jake Taylor. Jake is ProcureAbility's Senior Director of Advisory. Jake has 15 years of strategic consulting experience, has focused really across the procurement value chain, including sourcing, category management, supply negotiations, org design, pre and post merger integrations, you name it. Jake has played a role in really everything there is to do in the procurement space. So it'd be great to get the benefit of his experience. So with that all said, let's bring Jake on stage and go into today's conversation. Hey, Jake, there you go.
Hey, everyone.
How are you doing today?
Lovely, thank you.
Award for enthusiasm right out of the gate.
Got to.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. And you know, we always tee up these questions or these sessions with the same question because it really helps us understand a little bit more about your background. And so I have to pose this to you. That is, did procurement find you or did you find procurement?
Excellent question. Procurement found me. I was a techie back in the day and was looking for a career change and something that could be more strategic, get me out of the office, working with clients, doing a little travel. And naturally, procurement was one of those, just foundational roles that touches all of those areas, and was able to find a great role in procurement.
Now, I think you said a little travel. That might be under-egging it a little bit. I know in your bio, you said that you're looking for a client to take you to Antarctica. And, if you find that client, then please allow me to come along for the ride. But I think that you've taken the opportunity to travel as well through, your career in procurement.
Yeah, absolutely. A little less travel these days than probably pre-pandemic, but I'm still looking for that client in Antarctica. So if anyone's on the line and has any work to be done down there, happy to be a part of that.
Well, what we want to do today, as I teed up, is talk a lot about procurement operating models and if they're shifting, how to think about them, how to think about your current model, if things need to change. And what we did as a run-up to today's AOP Live is we just asked a poll on LinkedIn. It's a snap poll on LinkedIn with our community to ask about operating models and operating models that their teams uses. And so I brought this up on screen for everybody watching, but I'm going to read it out just for anybody who may be listening later. And the question we posed was, which procurement operating model does your team use? And there were 4 answers that we're able to give through a LinkedIn poll. The results were centralized model, 45%, a center-led model was 33%, decentralized model was 14%, and a matrixed model was 9%. And Jake, I want to come to you just for your perspectives on that first. But before I do, just from a point of language, could you just talk a little bit about the difference between centralized and center-led?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So centralized is classic command and control. All operations within procurement fall under a CPO, and it's no matter where the purchasing is being originated from, anywhere in the world or any business unit, it is conducted by procurement in, call it, one office. And then a center-led is a policies and procedures and technology is controlled by that procurement organization, but the roles or responsibilities are, say, dotted line into either business units or financial entities.
Mm-hmm. And so did the results surprise you, or were they in line with what you would expect in the mini poll that we did?
Yeah, a little surprised that centralized is by far the top number here. We've been seeing, and I can get into later, kind of some of the trends of moving away from centralized. I would say a lot of procurement professionals prefer centralized, right? It's easier, better data, more control in the process, but we're seeing more moving away towards a center-led or hybrid type of model. So I would suspect some of this is centralized, except for here, or mostly centralized with a few exceptions. So it's never really fully a clean centralized, especially with global organizations when there's post-merger type of entities within the fold. But a little surprising to see so many of the respondents with a centralized model.
Kelly, what were your thoughts as you saw that?
Well, it's interesting. My thoughts are actually very much along the lines of Jake's. If we had tweaked this question slightly, and instead of asking which procurement operating model does your team use, and we had asked which operating model does your spend exist within or follow, I have a feeling the answer would probably be all of the above. Especially as technology makes it easier for self-guided buying, self-sourcing, and there's always those specialized pockets of spend that are handled in some unique way because of what they mean to the operation. I suspect that the distribution would be slightly different. So interesting maybe to think about some of the ways that procurement's organization versus how the spend is actually being managed could differ.
Yeah, I think it's going to be is what I find interesting, and this is something I'm really interested in kind of unpacking as we go through the conversation, is that, procurement organizations sometimes go on a maturity journey, which starts off with, we're really decentralized. So it's like, okay, we've got to decentralize. So everything goes to a decentralized model. And then when you're in a decentralized model, it's, we got everything, we kind of got our arms around a lot of things, but is this the most optimum operating model for the organization? And then it's like, okay, maybe we'll kind of drop down a tier, if you will, and go to a center-led model, and how that kind of journey kind of pans out, depends on where they are on the maturity journey. That centralized isn't necessarily the be all and everything that used to be as you started on a transformation program.
And I would love to see the data behind this too, to show of the centralized, how many where are they in that maturity journey, how new an organization, which industries do they fall in, and so forth. I think that would be some interesting insights there as well.
So as we really want to talk about two different areas in the AOP Live today, we want to talk about the current operating models, some of the implications around those operating models, and then around driving change, as we're looking, as a function at how do we need to think about when to change, how to change, the journey to go on to change. And to really kick that off, I'd love to know, just from your perspective, we brought up 4 different operating models there, but what are some of the pros and cons of those most popular procurement operating models that you see?
Yeah, absolutely. And all of them do have pros and cons, and it's probably most important to note that there is no one answer for the best or the proper operating model for an organization. There's a lot of nuance there, and if I could, maybe I'll take a step back. And why are we even having this conversation? Why did I bring up this topic? This is an old, having this conversation of centralized, decentralized, what's the proper model, right? It's decades old. This is not a new innovative topic, but why it is relevant today is we are seeing more and more of our clients coming out of, the supply chain crisis, where lead times were through the roof. It was hard to find product, especially materials coming from Asia. That it was, I'm sure this audience is, tired of debating, how do we become more resilient and how do we address the supply chain shortage that many of us face. Hopefully looks like some of those lead times are returning back to normal. And now organizations are asking, okay, for the next crisis, whatever that might be, another pandemic, another supply disruption coming from certain countries where we purchase our product, can our organization be more resilient for some of those changes? And can we be better prepared, not just from a policy or a process or technology perspective, but from an actual operating model,
Mhm.
we need to put more resources in the local countries where we're doing our purchasing. So to move then to kind of, why pros and cons, and, going back to this classic debate, given the new world that we live in, it's probably important to note, right, the journey that organizations take, when they start implementing an operating model, that a new organization that is not mature, all purchasing is done by the business, by the stakeholders. It's just go get whatever you need. We're growing. We need to be fast, first to market. Then eventually the leadership says, oh, we need to put some controls in place. We need to, have some procurement organization, better manage our spend, more effectively manage our spend. So then they start implementing a classic central model, centralized procurement owned by the CPO. Here's our policies. You're not approved to purchase whatever you want anymore. And then over time, as you noted, Philip, that, okay, now maybe centralized, there's too much controls. It's too bureaucratic. It's too slow to purchase. We need to move some of that back to the business. So we'll be more decentralized, putting more power with the stakeholders, and we'll put more procurement with the local businesses. So the classic pros and cons between the two, getting back to your question, is, it's the balance between speed and control, right? And a decentralized model focuses more on speed of getting product faster to the stakeholders, whereas a centralized model focuses more on the controls, on, ensuring that procurement is the fiduciary expert of spending the company's money effectively, with value, with the right suppliers, managing that risk. There is no proper answer one end of the spectrum or the other. It's a balance for every organization. And I think hybrid has developed to kind of be that middle ground between the effective speed of procurement with the right controls, ensuring risk is properly evaluated for all the supply base.
So what would a hybrid organization structure or organization design typically look like?
So there's a centralized ownership of procurement. So they one body for policies, procedures, roles and responsibilities, creating what a procurement should look like in an organization. But the alignment, so the tactics, sit with the business, so that we call it a category manager sits in centralized procurement, but is focused on a business unit or a geography or a certain entity, so they have that local perspective in mind when they're managing the customer service with their clients.
Now, do you see, because it's really fascinating, you think about, you start the decentralized, then you're kind of going up, getting more control, then you're distributing a little bit more control back in the business. Is the end goal to ultimately go back to decentralized, but decentralized with, I hate using the word control because it supposes that we're a control function, but oversight, let's say, and with strategically placing resources where we need them. Is that where you think we're heading? Or, I mean, I know you said there's no one size fits all, but do you see that as a potential kind of continuation of where the models may go?
Well, the pendulum is always swinging back and forth, right? And there's certain catalysts for why this gets looked at or why it gets addressed, right? A new leadership, new CPO, a merger. There's issues with, say, some outsourced functions, and so we have to realign some of the roles and responsibilities that might not be working. But those aren't root causes, right? So a root cause for why this should be addressed or even looked at, right? Let's say a CPO comes in and she looks at her organization and metrics are being hit, customers are happy, everything is running smoothly, great cycle times. There's really no reason to do a full org assessment and potential shifting here. But if there are, suppliers aren't happy, their invoices aren't being paid, cycle times are very high, stakeholders are complaining, a number of root causes, that's the reason for really addressing this. And like we've seen, as I mentioned, in the last year with the supply chain disruptions and lack of supply, that's another reason for looking to address some of these reasons, some of these org changes. So I think that's kind of why organizations are swinging from one end to the other. And my perspective is, yes, that it is swinging more to a decentralized model, but to do that effectively, because we've probably all seen when it's too decentralized, data suffers. You start seeing rogue procurement organizations finding ways to procure outside of the proper channels. So there needs to be still some, I'll say the word controls, even though it does, I agree, have a negative kind of connotation to being, the Orwellian control panel. But there is that need for, here's the policy, here's the process. Everyone should be following the same process, even if you're in a different geography or a different business unit, with your requirements being met, uniquely as needed.
As I think about the different triggers of, looking from stage to stage, and you talked a little bit about, sometimes when there's something that's broken, or there's, perhaps an organization is tracking Net Promoter Score and the scores are really low, or, they feel there's a burning platform to change. When I put my entrepreneurial hat on, I think the best time to drive change is actually when everything's firing on all cylinders, because you're doing it from a point of strength. And I just wonder if you observe whether there are procurement leaders out there who are taking that approach of, I want to continuously improve, I just don't want to rest on my laurels, versus there's a problem that's broken, I got to figure out a way to go and fix it.
I wish more procurement leaders thought like that. Absolutely. I think these types of fundamental changes typically occur when there is something broken and it's an acute issue. I've seen when things are firing smoothly and everything's great, the economy's great, less emphasis on cost savings. There's budget, usually more from a technology. Let's look at our technology, because that's an expensive one. So organizations might address, new implementations or which technology is best in class, which is a topic for another day. But I will maybe also state that, in my view, the procurement's role is customer service to its stakeholders. That's its primary, call it mission statement, is it needs to be purely focused on achieving the procurement, goods and services needs of its business stakeholders. Secondary comes, how do we more effectively extract value from our suppliers? How do we ensure our metrics are being hit? That's an output or outcome of, servicing your supply base, right? We hear all the time, the number one complaint when there's a problem with the org model or processes is business stakeholders say, oh, I just hate working with procurement. It takes so long. It's bureaucratic. They don't understand my needs. I'm an engineer at a plant. I have to go into the technology and enter a purchase request, and I don't know the tool. I have to learn it myself. I don't speak procurement. Right? That's a classic trigger to address something needs to change within procurement. All right. And there's a number of levers. It's not just operating model. Yes, the policy, the processes, the technology usage, maybe operating model. We often recommend that, for procurement organizations that take their eye off the ball of customer service first, service your stakeholders, make them happy, is, that white glove concierge desk approach where procurement should be done by procurement. The need needs to originate with the business, of course. But from there, let procurement do it. Let us, work with you on understanding your requirements, your needs. You shouldn't be happy. We won't reject a PR, make you start over from scratch because you put the wrong cost center in there. That approach of being customer service first, if that's in violation, if that's not occurring, that's a clear need for an assessment as far-reaching as potentially updating the operating model.
Yeah, I really agree with the customer service first, because that's where you may even be hitting your metrics or feel that you're hitting metrics. But if the perception in the organization is of you making life difficult or there's poor customer service, that's where the conversation happens when, the COO is in the car with the CEO, on the drive to a manufacturing plant or to a conference or to a meeting where someone's saying, procurement's really making my life difficult. And when those conversations happen, it doesn't matter what your metrics show, because that ultimately comes, kind of organizational fact. And you got to really focus on that, ultimately to change the hearts and minds of the execs, to then be the ones that are pushing engagement with procurement if you're having engagement difficulties.
Yeah, absolutely. We had a client that was so focused on cycle times as a metric, ostensibly to serve the customers, to say we want to make procurement as fast as possible, so we're measuring our cycle times. But what happened over time was to kind of work on the cycle time measurement. They shifted more of the burden to the stakeholders to do the quotes and find the suppliers before a purchase request is opened. to reduce the cycle time so that when a PR is opened, a lot of the procurement work has already been done. That's putting the burden on the stakeholder at the sake of reducing cycle times.
Yeah.
That's not customer service. That's a backwards metric then, if that's what's happening.
So, Kelly, I want to come over to you because I think there's been some questions that have been coming in from the audience. I want to give you the opportunity to pose a couple of them to Jake.
Absolutely. Thank you. And there have been. So, Jake, let me start here with you. A question from Darius. How do you think the application of machine learning and artificial intelligence technology, everybody now is being forced to answer the question, how is ChatGPT going to change the way you do your job or we do our jobs? But how might developments in automation, increases in the user friendliness of automation, potentially start to influence procurement operating models, either in the near future or maybe longer term, if you have a thought on that?
Yeah, very interesting and very topical. My honest answer is it's too soon to tell. And that's not a way to try to dodge the question. But I think that, machine learning has been around for a little bit, but, AI and ChatGPT, are newer models or newer tools, I should say. How I believe this will affect in maybe the mid to longer term and not necessarily the near term, because I don't see it affecting anything, in the next couple of years, except for interesting and maybe some more insights and so forth. But I think that the tactical element of some of this can be reduced. So for buying teams, for offshore, downstream, if there's, below certain spend thresholds, 3 bids and a buyer required, the teams that are doing that can definitely be affected by some of this AI, where you could pull some of that information without having to do the calling or quoting, pulling, scraping off of sites, certain pricing, if it's off the shelf pricing. I think for more of that tactical work that perhaps is outsourced today by some organizations, the need and headcount for doing some of those more tactical activities, we definitely could see more automation. We're seeing some of that today, but I think the heart of this question is more not routine automation and machine learning, but more of the customized or unique skill sets that a ChatGPT can bring. I think that's going to definitely affect more the downstream procure to pay functions.
Yeah. Now, actually, speaking of headcount and skill sets, Mahesh asks an interesting question. We're talking about the way that these teams operate, but in terms of the expertise that individuals have within the team, Manesh asks, moving aside from different types of models for a moment, are there new roles that are being created? And you might observe, Jake, that within, as companies move from maybe centralized to center-led to some form of hybrid or matrixed organization, that it changes the different types of roles and skills that they need to have within the team. But I remember for a while there having a dedicated data scientist or an analytics person that was a resource for the whole team was sort of the hot trend. We haven't discussed that quite as much. Maybe we've shifted our attention over to tech. But any comments you'd have for Mahesh around specific role changes that tend to accompany these transitions from one model to another?
Yeah, excellent question. Yeah, I do. I'm still a big proponent of a center of excellence, which is not a new concept in of itself, but I think that will become more important with AI, with ChatGPT, with data becoming more prevalent, of developing insights from data. That is at its heart a centralized role. So getting back to the center-led versus decentralized, an analytics function, a center of excellence. So for data warehousing, collection of insights and market intel, you can have great metrics and metric gathering, but is it insightful? Does it lead to change? Mm-hmm. That is by its nature a center of excellence type of role to perform, which should be centralized, clearly with local perspectives as needed. But there will be the need for more data scientists, AI engineers, and intelligence around what to do with this data that, now there's more data than we know what to do with, right? With all the different spend and UPC data and cost data and suppliers. It's the trick is going to be, how do we make all this data we're collecting insightful? And that's going to be the role of data scientists. Absolutely.
Yeah. Now, if I can ask one more question of my own before I hand you back to Phil to take the conversation forward. We've thought about skills. We've thought about how tech has changed things. one of the things we talk about a lot is where category expertise needs to reside. And I imagine there's some interplay there with operating models. So some categories, you're going to have expertise within procurement. Some categories, that expertise is going to reside within the business. And then in third cases, it may be where you bring in an external expert to bring in that market point of view and that true category expertise. What type of interaction do you see between how procurement is managing processes and some of those customer support things that we've talked about, and where the knowledge actually resides around individual spend categories?
Yeah. Classic question about, bringing in category expertise to service the stakeholders in certain areas where, for example, marketing or legal comes from a very, captive industry, and a lot of the spend, in a lot of organizations, marketing is very high, and marketing will say, we all come from agencies. Procurement doesn't have this expertise. We'll negotiate with the ad agencies. We got this, and we'll just come to you, procurement, for when we need an invoice or a contract signed. So how do you then, as a procurement organization, bring in that expertise to be able to provide that value to your clients, to your customers in legal, marketing, or HR and so forth? I would say along the maturity model, clearly as an organization tries to increase the spend that it touches, that it manages, you're going to need that expertise, right? You're going to need to have marketing experts that can speak the language of ad agencies. If you're going to be touching legal spend that understand, RFPs with law firms doesn't really work very well. There's different ways of extracting value and so forth. So yes, as an organization becomes more mature, you're going to need to bring in category expertise. But that also depends on the spend and velocity of negotiating with that supply base. So marketing, I would, as a blanket statement, say, yes, you need to bring in marketing experts into the procurement organization, or maybe there's a rotational program where, marketing professionals within your organization move from, product to procurement to different type of marketing functions within the business to kind of, do a rotation type perspective. But if there's not a lot of spend, maybe a classic example would be HR benefits, right? You don't need to negotiate your HR benefits every year. Maybe it's every 2 to 5 years. You don't need a captive HR benefit expert within procurement. You could bring in an expert then, on a more ad hoc basis. So I think it's looking at the velocity of your spend, the size of your spend, the relationship with your stakeholders. Are they working with procurement? Do they involve you from a strategic perspective? Do you have insights into demand planning, so you have a seat at the table sooner as a procurement organization? If that's the case, then definitely you're going to need category experts in some of the more niche areas.
Excellent. Thank you, Jake. Well, I can see more questions have come in while we were chatting. So Phil, I will hand back to you and then go take a look at those.
Thanks, Kelly. And actually, I was looking off screen here because it was a really good question about organization design. I know that the team at ProcureAbility actually just published a series. I'm just looking off screen because I'm reading it on my second screen here, called Bold Procurement Predictions for 2030 Insight Series. So I would recommend anyone to Google that, because there's a big section there on virtual, let me see where it is, virtual organization design, which talks a little bit more detail about that we just don't have time to go into today, but I know there's some content out there. So please, if you are interested in that topic a little bit more, go and Google that series and check out some of the insights and thoughts there. Now, I wanted to follow up on one of the other questions. Jake, you talked about being a fan of a center of excellence model. Is there a minimum team size or spend, or kind of how do you frame out when a procurement group is big enough to justify building a center of excellence model around it? Or can it be done for teams of any size? It's just a matter of, portioning off a couple of people that are focused on process, tools, technology?
Yeah, I would argue any size, any stage of maturity could use a center of excellence, right? It's in the earlier days, it's, how do we make our spend categorization make sense so we could do better reporting? Is there more alignment on what our cost centers look like, what our commodity codes look like, and that's a role for center of excellence, right? Of making sure the data, the garbage in, garbage out, right? You can't make sense of, we talked about with data scientists until your data's in a good spot, right? There's always going to be insights that should be warehoused centrally, whether it's a consulting report, benchmarks, learnings, the RFPs. So if your procurement team is doing RFPs year in and year out, is that data being collected somewhere, or your results, your benchmarking of rates, so that you have so much data that just gets lost if it's stored on a hard drive or people leave, that there needs to be kind of that data warehouse for that. And it can become more sophisticated and bigger as an organization grows. Another key metric is developing the ROI of your procurement organization. So best in class companies are maybe 6 to 10x they're giving back to the organization, to their cost. So if you could accurately calculate the ROI of your organization and it's in the positive, and there still isn't a center of excellence, I would argue it's time to implement one.
No, I know this. If you don't have the answer to this question, then please, that's no problem. But as you were talking about metrics, it just brought another question to my mind: is like, do you look at? Because I often get this question, and I don't necessarily have a good answer. Is my spend is X? How many people should I have in my team? That's kind of a driver of whether I have an efficient or an effective, or whether I should be hiring 5 people or 10 people, or based on what the spend, which is always the metric that people look at to judge that. Is there any kind of standard kind of baseline data, or kind of how do you look at an org design when it comes to making sure it's scaled for the right level of spend?
Yeah, there are definitely metrics for that. I don't know if I would use them as the Bible for what that means for your team. It's spend as a percent of revenue, but then you also balance spend under contract, spend that is touched, the velocity of spend, the year-over-year savings. I think at the heart of this conversation too, right, with operating models, is if we are moving towards a more decentralized model for the sake of speed, which I think more organizations are doing, you will naturally increase, speed metrics, so cycle times, customer satisfaction, and there will be a reduction in year-over-year savings of spend under contract, right? There's going to be less of an emphasis on, cost takeout and savings, which is, that centralized perspective or bias with more control for the sake of speed and supplier performance. So there are metrics to look at, is my team right sized, or are we too heavy? But there's nuances there. And I hate to give the consulting answer, it depends, but is your organization focused on, category, or are they focused on a business unit? There's different needs there, and you might be more organizationally resourced for a localized perspective versus a centralized. Okay, we're going to manage all of our temp labor spend globally under one group, regardless of the geography. There, you could probably streamline some of the headcount, but then again, you're forsaking the customer service, localized speed perspective.
It's one of those questions. I think everyone's always in search of a single answer, and there is no single answer. How does geographic complexity impact what organization design you may think about from a procurement perspective?
Well, it definitely does add complexity. I would say when we look at this, if there's a globally footprint organization, that looking at where the spend is occurring, right? So generally speaking, indirect spend should be centrally managed, and there's of course exceptions to that. Facilities or financial auditing and even marketing, right? We'll need some local perspective in buying, but for the most part, indirects can be central. Then for directs, for manufacturing, or for banking with IT knowledge, that should be more managed and owned by the geographic centers, entities, business units, whatever it is that is in different geographies. So then you have to then balance, what is the proper distinction between headcount that is focused on that spend from a centralized versus a decentralized model or perspective. I'll also add what's interesting too, which is still in flux. Post-pandemic, there's a lot of change of course, work from home or work remote. That changes this dynamic a little bit about, can you have if classically centralized headquarters is in London, your team's in London, and you're moving more to a decentralized model, could you still have that headcount in London, but say working with Italy or working more remote where maybe the Italian team is remote anyway. So what is really, if it's roughly the same time zone, that changes the dynamic a little bit as well. So it's mostly around, I would say, looking at the spend. I will mention, culturally speaking, there's really no difference between, an operation in a low-cost country or, other geographies. So there should not be any, differences in metrics or targets for one organization versus another, just depend on which geography that they sit in.
It's an interesting point around how the work from home is changing it, because traditionally you would place somebody locally or keep somebody locally when you're designing your org, because they're in the office with the rest of the team all the time. So it's a cultural kind of connection. But if that doesn't exist, then it takes away some of the need to have folks located in that specific place.
Yeah, as long as the language is
yes,
I would say, that's still a requirement. That'll never change.
And they still need to understand the culture, right? Because you can have, a team in Brazil, and I mean, as I've seen managing global teams, you still need that connection between local stakeholders and somebody who they think is an advocate for them. And so sometimes that requires somebody who is local or has the language or understands regional nuances that perhaps centralized folks may not understand just because they're not in the market all the time.
Absolutely.
Kelly, I'm going to come back to you with any other questions that we may have received over the last 10 minutes or so.
Sure. And I'll actually start, Jake, it's so interesting you talk about the difference between centralization and localization. To a certain extent, I think we've all just absorbed the location shifts that we've experienced over the last few years. But with a lot of whether it's digital procurement systems that we're using or communications platforms, I almost find I'm more surprised when I find out someone is near me, right? Because everyone is so accessible through all of these different platforms. So I think maybe that's something for, certainly everybody listening and watching today to continue to think about, and for all of us to think about going forward. You can support a global organization really from anywhere. And so it's sort of two different decisions for procurement to make, from a process consistency, I'll say that instead of control type of a perspective or a decision-making perspective, versus actually where is the team. It kind of brings some different variation into those choices. Now, a couple of the questions that have come in, I have one from Sathish, and I think what he's asking about here is the transition. So he's talking about, how would it work for a global company with multiple regional centralized teams to bring all of procurement under one global org? Do you recommend going first to centralized, first to center-led, and then maybe a move towards centralized, or working through something hybrid? What do these transitions tend to look like, regardless of where procurement is trying to end up with their operating model?
Yeah, interesting. I'll try to unpack that one a little bit. So I would assume with multiple regional centralized teams, that might be an output of some consolidation or purchasing mergers, I should say, right, of different groups then that keep that core team in whichever location that they are. And this organization is looking at, is that effective? What should we move towards given our different offices? That's probably a big leap to go centralized with this type of infrastructure in place. That's a big change with regionalized teams. So this is a classic, call it matrix, right? Where you have centralized teams all over the world, probably reporting up through, common channels. My perspective, without understanding more information, is a center-led is the most appropriate, call it a path of least resistance, given multiple purchasing teams all over the world. So moving under one global org, with the exception of, say, a center of excellence, and I would still argue there needs to be one set of policies and procedures and documentation, but still focusing on that the regional purchasing. Otherwise, the stakeholders in this company, this example, we'll start seeing the effects of that, and they will start complaining. And I used to have my team and my purchasing locally here in this office, and now they've moved to London or wherever. I'm slowing down my purchase needs, and that's unacceptable. So a little bit of a center-led approach sounds like the most appropriate in this case.
Yeah. Now you bring up stakeholders. Garrett's asked a question, and I'll read it in first, and then I'm going to broaden it a little bit. So he's asked, how do you change engagement with stakeholders that reach out to procurement after the deal has been made? So if we think about sourcing project has ended, contract is now in place, you go into sort of that medium term where you're working with the supplier either directly or through systems. Either specifically this question or more generally, if procurement is modifying or clarifying the operating model that they work in, how might that change the way that they engage with stakeholders at different points in the cycle? And any sort of warnings or advice or things that you can point out so that people maybe don't fall in and make some common mistakes that might otherwise happen during such a shift.
Yeah, we see this a lot, and this is where procurement is unable to show or add its value when the stakeholders are already negotiating, already selecting, and saying, we have these people starting on Monday. Procurement, please, sign this contract and allow us to issue the PO. This is probably first before even an org model discussion, a policy or process discussion around how do you then showcase to this. I'm assuming the stakeholders here don't see the value of procurement. They're going to do it on their own. Maybe this is that classic marketing example of, we negotiate with agencies, so we're just going to do that. And then just have procurement, rubber stamp it through. There's a bit of change management that needs to happen here where procurement needs to show to these stakeholders, we have the knowledge, we could take some of this burden of negotiating off of your hand. You're still the ultimate decision maker. We're just here to help facilitate the process. We could bring in some new thinking about, how to squeeze rates or how to extract value or introduce some competition to make sure that any incumbents aren't feeling, protected or safe. And that's obviously a way that when procurement isn't involved, that can easily happen. So first and foremost, I would say and it's a big lift. That's not an easy thing to do, but how do you, present to these stakeholders that, hey, procurement can have a seat at the table sooner before you select, negotiate your supply base. And then to overlay that, to your question, Kelly, with the operating model, that could be an example of, well, it's a centralized model and these stakeholders are in a unique environment with unique requirements that HQ doesn't seem to understand or, aren't paying attention to because they're not staffed or have the teams in place properly. So that could be another clue around, okay, we need to look at, do we want to decentralize a bit more to have some teams sitting in this location where these stakeholders are to understand that local or category specific knowledge that today these stakeholders don't seem to entrust with procurement.
Absolutely. Because the operating model does exist in addition to company culture, individual procurement, either individual human or individual functional relationships. Absolutely. So there's a lot of different things to consider. Phil, I'm going to hand back to you for the last part of the conversation here.
All right. Thanks, Kelly. And I wanted to build on that question actually from Garrett just a little bit. As you think about, post-deal support, so post-contract signing support, is there a philosophy or a best practice that you see in how engaged should procurement, how should the operating model be built in a way that continues procurement's engagement after a deal has been signed, should I say? Because oftentimes you go through the classic sourcing process, the deal is signed. Okay, stakeholders, it's on you. You deal with performance management, you deal with relationship management, you deal with governance, come back to us, in 2 years when the deal is signed. Like, do you build in or do you attempt to build in more procurement support post-deal into the operating model?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's classic customer relationship CRM, or SRM, supplier relationship management around, yes, once a deal is signed, especially with these, large key suppliers where, marketing or legal, right, that they don't want to use procurement because they can't do this. That's value add that procurement organizations need to show that they can provide is we will, be all things suppliers except for the actual selection of that vendor, right? You have your requirements. You have, as the budget owner, right, the ability to purchase whatever material and service that you need. We will just be the facilitators of that process, including the management of that supplier to ensure that they are living up to the deals of the contract, the commercial terms of the contract. That should be an easy sell to stakeholders to say, we will manage the QBRs, right? We will be the bad cop of if they're, on-time performance violations or customer service or downtime, whatever the need is in the contract or the KPIs in the contract. That should be something that procurement should be showcasing. And that's definitely an area of investment if it's not happening today.
Sure. And I'm just actually going to jump in here with you, Jake, while we work on some tech stuff. When we think about what the right operating model is for procurement, and especially if they're moving from one to another, to what extent is this a conversation that should involve people outside of procurement? Should we take C-level input? Should we be discussing with key internal stakeholder groups? Or is this something that internally we should be able to figure out, potentially with some form of third-party support, and then sort of roll that out and communicate it out to the rest of the business?
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts there, right? So first one you just touched on at the very end of your question about change management, right? Yeah. So anything around org clearly needs to have careful change management implications, because we're humans. When we hear org, especially if there's a third party involved doing this assessment, oh my gosh, is my job going to be on the line? Am I going to have to move to a new country or report to a new boss? Job responsibilities changing. That's usually not the case. Clearly sometimes that can happen, of course, but usually when there's an assessment or looking at some of these, changes that we're talking about, it's not about a riff or anything like that. It's streamlining the processes to be more effective, as I would argue, customer service, right? And there's a huge change management piece, and that involves, to the first part of your question, understanding with senior leadership, are they on board? Are they willing to fund this? Are they willing to back it? Will they communicate from the highest of levels? The CEO, ideally, if there's a big org change, because there is a violation of customers aren't happy, procurement is slow, too many approvals required in purchasing. You took away my P cards and I'm not happy about it. There needs to be from senior leadership, we heard you, change is coming. We're addressing some of these pain points. This will be a multi-year journey. Here's some quick wins that we could have. And that's vital for involving senior leadership on this assessment, on what is the mission statement of procurement, what is some of those bottlenecks or pain points, how can they be addressed? Again, org changes can be a key driver of that, but it doesn't always have to be the org. It can be other levers, policy, process, center of excellence, data scientists, all these many, many levers to look at kind of addressing some of those.
Excellent. And Phil, I'll hand back to you.
Yeah, thanks for jumping in, Kelly. My webcam decided to turn itself off randomly, but we're able to bring it back on again. So I want a follow-up question to that, Jake, is how involved and engaged should we bring kind of the stakeholders into the conversation around operating model? Like, how much of it is where procurement, and this is the model we think is the most effective for the business, versus we're going out and we're going to do focus groups and surveys and one-on-one conversations and bringing executives? Like, what's the balance between bringing folks from stakeholders into the conversation versus being led too much by them?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Bring in stakeholders, do focus groups, interviews. Everyone will be honest. Every interview I've had with a business stakeholder about how is procurement at this company, what are your pain points, what are your issues, they are more than verbose and honest about their feelings and how great it is or how terrible it is. I'll never forget one interview. One stakeholder said working with procurement is a Kafka-esque nightmare. That went on a slide to senior leadership and said, this is how your stakeholders view working with procurement. And from that is where change is really necessary and driven. I would advise this should be looked at a minimum every 5 years. It doesn't mean you have to do a reorg and, org change and drastic update every 5 years, but to address this, to do those interviews, to get a pulse of, again, I would argue customer service first, mindset of, that white glove service is what procurement should be providing to its business stakeholders. And from that flows KPI tracking and all the other value add advanced tactics that procurement can do. And that comes from hearing and listening to the business first.
Mm-hmm. Now, do you have any advice on how to, as you're going through that change, and that change can be quite disruptive of operating model from model A to model B, on how to make sure that you don't drop the customer service ball while you're going through that transition? Because it's easy to, as a professional, in that situation, it's easy to think, okay, I'm going to forget everything that went before and all my old responsibilities because now my new job today is this. And I just wonder how you think about that as you go through transitions.
Yeah, I mean, it should be clear that the reason for the change is to shift more towards customer service, and that should be the impetus for most all of this. If it is driven by, we need to be more cost focused or bottom line focused, that's harder to justify when there's a big change as far as the change management messaging. Everybody should be able to get on board with we want to be more customer service focused and oriented. That's a necessary change, but also one that's more palatable to businesses, and that kind of helps with that transition. Is probably the way I would look at that.
Okay, thanks. And really, one last question, just given where we are from a time perspective, and it's building on the question that actually Satish asked earlier, which we talked about the coming together of different models or bringing together different models. Now you've got a lot of experience. We talked about this right at the beginning, supporting procurement through mergers. So whether it's pre, through, post merger, what usually happens, or what's kind of the approach that anyone in that situation should take to think about bringing two different operating models together?
Yeah, this is not a focus, unfortunately, post-merger, right? Post-merger is usually about synergies and collecting synergy dollars to justify the merger in the first place for whoever blessed it and said, here's all the value capture from doing a merger. Org, because in nature, it's, hard and big, and, there's already enough concern when there's a merger about jobs and so forth, that, org changes are kind of a secondary priority. Versus is let's get those synergy dollars, and then let's have the day one and see what happens, and then usually 1 to 2 or 3 years out is when someone says, okay, these two operating models are in violation, so now let's address that. But it's already been now a couple of years of an imbalance, improper teaming and processes between two distinct organizations. I wish this would be addressed post merger as part of a clean room pre-merger approach. But it doesn't often happen.
And as you then start to look at these two different models, like how do you start in terms of thinking what is the optimal? And it's not necessarily a choice between A and B. It can be a hybrid of the two. But how do you even start thinking about bringing together two separate operating models into a singular model?
Yeah, I would look at kind of the goals and perspective of, if procurement rolls up into finance, the financial organization, are they in the industry that this merger exists in? Is it a bottom line focused? Every shaved penny off of cost affects the bottom line and is super important. That would then be argument for more of a centralized model, more policies and procedures in place to ensure that there's compliance to rates and so forth, and more purchase with negotiated suppliers. If it is more historically, say, a tech oriented, where speed is important and entrepreneurship, and Kelly, you mentioned earlier about the culture of the organization, that plays into org design. I had a tech client that mentioned savings is a bad word, right? We don't operate that way. We are entrepreneurial, and we want as few rules in place. We don't like rules. That's our, maybe that's changed in the last year with some of the tech layoffs that have been happening. But that's going to be a different operating model that would become an output of this merger. So I would look at kind of what is the perspective and needs of finance and procurement in the organization. Is it more cost focused? Is it more customer service focused? Repeating myself, would argue to be always more customer service focused, but that dictates a little bit around what that operating model should look like.
All right, well, Jake, I want to wrap up here and just thank you so much for your time and for the insights, the expertise and the experiences you've been able to share with us today. And, that focus on procurement as a customer service focused organization, but obviously not one that says yes to everything, but that has the customer in mind and the customer experience in mind in a way that perhaps we haven't always done that, is definitely an important takeaway. So, Jake, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for the opportunity.
And I want to thank everybody who came and watched the video, listened along, for being a part of today's AOP Live, and who submitted questions along the way. Kelly, thank you for bringing those to Jake during the conversation.
Absolutely. And just before we wrap, in case this is lost on anybody, Kafka wrote about a guy who woke up as an enormous gross bug. If that is how procurement is being characterized internally, you may have a little bit more to think about than operating model. So that's a great memorable visual for you to leave us with, Jake. Thanks so much.
Absolutely.
All right. Well,
If
thank
you
you
don't
very
remember
much.
anything else, remember that.
Yeah, take that one away. Well, thanks a lot, everybody, once again, and we can't wait to talk to you all again soon. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.